This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The world went into shock on December 7, 1941, when the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the principal U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. The surprise attack would indeed, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt memorably put it, live in infamy. In retrospect, it seems like a strange decision to launch an attack on the richest and, at least potentially, the most powerful nation globally, especially if you are a modestly populated island nation already at war with China. However, the Japanese government had its reasons. Up until the mid-19th century, Japan had been an isolated island, closed to the world. It had developed its own unique culture. In 1854, Japan was pressured into opening its doors to Western culture and trade when it signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. Open trade caused a significant economic collapse. The Japanese government realized the only way they could survive in the cutthroat world of colonialism was by beating the Westerners at their own game. They built up an industrial base and a large navy to compete and protect their interests. They even participated in World War I on the Entente side in support of their British allies. However, despite their contribution, Japan was snubbed at the Paris Peace Treaty. The budding Japanese Empire did not receive the territories it believed they had earned through the sacrifices of their soldiers, and its racial equality proposals were voted down. War with China. Following the war, there were internal tensions in Tokyo. A power struggle took place between those who wished to continue to pursue good relations and trade with the West and elements in the military who believed that only a self-sufficient and expansionist empire could protect Japanese interests. The generals eventually won that struggle, creating what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. However, Tokyo faced a severe problem in creating an empire that could stand on its own 2 feet. Japan was, and remains, a series of islands without sufficient resources to sustain itself and nowhere near enough to engage in military expansion. Therefore, the Japanese military had to secure resources elsewhere. Luckily for the Japanese, their Chinese neighbors were fragile at the time. The weak and corrupt government of Chiang Kai-shek was unable to enforce sovereignty. To make matters worse, they faced an increasingly worsening insurrection from the Communist Party. They used the weakness of Beijing to their advantage, pushing for trade concessions and leases on land in Manchuria, a resource-rich province relatively close to Japan. In 1931, the Japanese military marched into Shenyang and placed a puppet regime in power. Tensions rose as it became clear that Tokyo wished to extend its empire throughout China. Aside from Chinese weakness, the international community was in no position to respond to Japanese aggression. Europe was divided into fascists, communists, and liberal Democrats. The League of Nations, designed to prevent international crises such as the one brewing in the Far East, could not cope. Both Japan and Germany had left, and the United States had never become a member. The Japanese felt, mistakenly as it turned out, that they could do as they wished in their own backyard and faced no consequences. Not everyone in Japan was convinced of the wisdom of this policy. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito had strong reservations. He commented that Japan underestimated China. It is most wise to end the war quickly and seek to build up our national strength for the next 10 years. However, he allowed Prime Minister Tojo Hideki to plot the course of Japanese policy. In 1937, an all-out war broke out between Japan and China. The communists and nationalists united against the common invader. The struggle is known to history as the Second Sino-Japanese War. However, many experts today believe this was the actual start of World War II. The Americans had long-standing trade interests in China. They also supported the government of Chiang Kai-shek against his communist rivals, led by Mao Zedong. Therefore, the Roosevelt administration watched Japanese intentions in Manchuria with increasing concern. However, the White House was seriously constrained by the isolationist Congress in place at the time. Therefore, their response was impotent, at least at first. The Japanese military overplayed its hand and engaged in unmitigated brutality. The atrocities it committed in Nanjing were known worldwide as the Rape of Nanking. The Imperial Japanese military slaughtered around 300,000 unarmed individuals. This atrocity and others gave the Roosevelt administration the support they needed to act. In 1938, the president passed a non-binding embargo on Japan, encouraging companies to avoid selling to Tokyo. By 1940, even Congress supported sanctions. It legislated the Export Control Act. The act did not formally ban sales of oil to Japan. However, it made it logistically impossible for Japan to buy what it needs in what was then the most significant energy market in the world. It was one of the most interventionist moves made by an isolationist Capitol Hill. They were simply disgusted with Japanese policy. The Americans certainly knew that an oil embargo would hurt Japan. However, they may not have calculated quite how dramatic its effects would be. Despite their significant inroads into China, Japan had not become less dependent on foreign oil. Unfortunately for them, 80% of its energy imports derived from the United States. However, in one fell swoop, Congress had severed its main pipeline of oil. The development placed the Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere in grave danger. It even posed a significant threat to the sustainability of the economy in the island homeland. The Japanese got most of their other resources elsewhere, but oil was difficult to attain. At this time, many of the largest oil reserves in the world remained undiscovered or relatively untapped. Japan had crafted strong relations with Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. However, both countries had limited supplies and could not help Japan. With the United States out of the picture, the only realistic source of oil was the Dutch East Indies. These islands, today known as Indonesia, were controlled by the Netherlands. However, the true protector of the Dutch East Indies was the British Empire, and more specifically, the Royal Navy stationed in Singapore. After World War II broke out in Europe, the British and Dutch zealously guarded the energy resources needed to pursue the war. They had no intention of trading with the Japanese, who were friendly with the other side. If the Japanese wanted oil, they would have to take it. However, that would involve becoming embroiled in the most devastating war in human history. To obtain the oil in the Dutch East Indies, Japan had to engage in war with the world's two most significant naval powers. They knew the British would defend the islands and strongly suspected the Americans would as well. However, Tojo knew that once they took the oil fields, their problems weren't over. The Americans and British would try to cut their naval supply lines, and together they were capable of doing so. Therefore, the Japanese Imperial Navy came up with a plan to neutralize both threats. They would launch attacks against the main British base in Singapore and, far more ambitiously, the U.S. base in Pearl Harbour. They were also concerned that the U.S. would use its colony in the Philippines to launch operations against their vulnerable supply lines. Therefore, they planned to take over those islands and install a Japanese regime in Manila. Once they had decided to pursue war, Japan knew it would have to invest all its efforts and resources into its new foreign policy direction. Therefore, it sought to cement its ties with Germany and Italy. On September 27, 1940, it signed the Tripartite Pact, linking its fate to Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. At the time, it seemed like a reasonably good idea. The Allies were still reeling from the fall of France in May, and the Soviet Union and the United States had not entered the war yet. To keep the Soviets out, they signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin in early 1941. Although diplomatic relations with Japan were in crisis at the time, the Americans did not believe Japan would pursue an all-out war against their far bigger and more prosperous country. However, Tojo was just desperate enough to gamble on Japan's existence. It was a gamble he lost with particularly awful results for his country. To learn more about the attack on Pearl Harbor and its causes, check out her book, Pearl Harbor, a captivating guide to the surprise military strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service that caused the United States of America's formal entry into World War II. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free Mythology Bundle ebook for free while still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.